So today I'm going to talk about all the major currencies in Asia. Right here, you're looking at the major groups of currencies in Asia. And basically what I would say is that there's a group of like tens, a group of hundreds, and a group of thousands. And each of these kind of determine the exchange rate with the dollar. So it's like the number of thousands to the dollar, the number of hundreds to the dollar, or the number of tens of dollars. So this first group is kind of interesting here. What I wanted to kind of focus on here is primarily the Chinese yuan, and kind of compare that with Singapore and Malaysia and the Australian dollar, as well as the Hong Kong dollar. So you might notice a couple things. First of all, I added Australia on this because actually Australia is extremely important in Asia. So because it's basically some of the same time zone. Um, Now, the other interesting thing here, primarily, is that Malaysia is kind of in the middle here, and that also Singapore is kind of the best, most valuable currency, and then Hong Kong is on the kind of other end of that. So it raises some very interesting questions. Now, the Chinese yuan also is, you can see that it's kind of made some progress in the last, well, before this 20 years ago, and then kind of in the last 10 years been struggling. So, at least against the dollar. So you can see that Hong Kong looks very, very solid here. Um, and in some ways, that is a very good thing because it means that they're very focused on keeping their exchange rates solid. So it kind of tells you something when you compare, say, Hong Kong to Singapore, or Singapore to Malaysia. So perhaps the most surprising thing here is why Indonesia and the Philippines are missing from this, or even Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, everybody really, right? So why are the other currencies worth so much less relative to the dollar? So essentially what you're looking at on the right-hand side of the scale here is a logarithmic graph. And you can see I put these pink lines kind of showing the ranges for the Australian dollar, going from 2 Australian dollars for 1 US dollar all the way to 1 to 1 for the US dollar. And then you can also see the years on the bottom graph there. So I kind of want to stay focused on Singapore for some of my personal interests, and also China, and then kind of like take a surprising look at Malaysia. So you can see Singapore here has, far back in the history was 2 to 1, and then more recently it's trying to make it down to essentially 1 to 1 with the dollar. So that may or may not be a good idea. Sometimes it's a good idea to be more valuable than the dollar, for example, right? So you can see that in recent years, it may have been struggling, right? So up until, from about a little, let's see, 2011 to 2020, it's basically been devalued, but then coming down recently, perhaps in around 2007 or 2017, 2018. This is the Singapore dollar. So the Malaysian currency, I'm a little bit more interested in Singapore, but actually Singapore is a small island, right? Similar to Hong Kong. So what this means is that, essentially on this lower half graph, we're only looking, even though it shows several different quote unquote countries, really the big player here is China and Malaysia and Australia, right? So you can kind of see that at a basic level, Australia is, fluctuating, a lot, but in general, trying to keep their currency as valuable as possible. So Malaysia may have kind of, because it's in the middle here, but it's also strange because around 2000 or 1998 to about 2006, you see that really straight part. So you can see as soon as they got devalued around 1998, they straightened things out and tried to stay lock solid, um, perhaps with the dollar. So, that may mean to try to control their inflation. So after that, they figured out what they were doing in 2006, and were actually to be able to gain against the dollar. And then something weird may have happened around 2015. So you can also see that same problem in Singapore as well, and even in Australia, you can see 24 around 2013 or so, right? So that problem started to go around that time frame. So it was also Australia, and you can also see in China, right? So uh, so there's a whole lot of like analysis you can do. Before 1982 in China, they had $1,000 bills and plus. So they completely redid their currency, but I wouldn't really say completely redid. Even in American currencies, we used to have $1,000, $100,000 bills, right? Um, and so we have to say that in general, the this time period really started with their idea to kind of stabilize their currency. Now you can see anytime it goes perfectly flat, it means it's almost dead linked with the dollar, right? So that in some ways is not a very good sign, but in other ways it is a good sign, because obviously the American currency floats. It's worth less every year, but this is showing the exchange rate, right, on a logarithmic graph. So basically what we like to see is a lot of little fluctuations that are fairly straight or stable. So, or going like we know that essentially, Asia is growing fast and they're building lots of things, and so we should kind of see a downward line, meaning that their currency should be getting more valuable. But we don't really see that, at least in the last, say, 10 to 20 years, right? So before that, around 2000 or so, you can see there was that kind of gradual drop in Singapore and so on, right? And same with in China. So uh, now the perhaps one of the world's most important currencies now is the Chinese yuan. So their size of their economy is the largest in the world. So their currency, because that's the most transactions, there still is a lot of, there's a lot to talk about here. But in general, we need to kind of look carefully at China. So this is really interesting because in some ways, I like to look at this a little bit skeptically, right? So you can see that of all these currencies, basically we're talking about the 10-to-1 ratios here, or the tens. So China is kind of, uh, and Hong Kong for that matter, is actually kind of in between the tens and hundreds debate. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That could be actually a very good thing in terms of trying to keep the Chinese currency as the primary currency in Asia. It is kind of annoying and in some ways not a good idea to have so many different currencies, although there's also a lot of nice things about having a lot of different currencies. So, but in general, what I was trying to say is that there's we want to really study China here, and look at how their exchange rate varies. But next, we're going to go on to these 100 categories. But all these are really in the Far East and Asia, and I did include. Um, I hope I included India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. And for some reason, I'm looking for India in here and I don't see it, so I'm gonna have to add it. So this orange line here that I just added is the Indian rupee. So um, it's actually an incredible currency because basically it's very floating, right? And you can see a lot of inflation across this. So that is a very bad thing, right? What we want to see, is exactly the opposite. However, it's a very interesting currency, right? Because It was at one time back in the 80s, 10 to 1, and then the 90s, essentially 20 to 1. And then in 2000 and so on, it started to go up even more. So, by 2006, it was like 40 to 1, and 2010, uh, you know, to 14, almost 50 to 1. And then today, it's essentially 75 rupees for $1. So what I noticed, I'll show you the next graph here, that Bangladesh, their neighbors, essentially have the same currency, right? But what India's policy has been to essentially make sure that their currency is slightly more valuable than Bangladesh's currency. Now, uh, studying some details in foreign trade, you'll see that Bangladesh, they make a lot of clothes and a lot of things like this. So, uh, but uh, but the point being is that the currency is worth essentially what someone else will pay for it for the product, and so on. But a super interesting currency in Asia, even though this is quite far from, say, uh, not super super far, but from Singapore and far out Indonesia or Australia and so on, or even China, right? So, but again, you can see that the rest of the countries have been a lot more careful with their money, with the exception of India and Bangladesh. But even that is not totally true, because we're going to look at the very highest levels in a moment here. So here's kind of the grand what's going on, right? So you can see here kind of the uh, edge of this, 100 land, or 100 to 1 is kind of almost heading into 200 to 1, right? And Pakistan, and actually Japan is really hard focused on 100 to 1, but and in some ways, what we're kind of expecting is, either a totally new currency, which I'll kind of talk about in something else, in terms of cryptocurrency, and certain governments working on this kind of project, right? So, but the interesting thing here is that, so you can see that Japan, although is 100 to 1, uh, and it's been that way for quite a long time, right? So, or even almost 300 to 1, uh, back in the 1980s, right? So, but basically what you see is that none of the other countries, except for India, has had such huge, drastic changes in their currency. So you got to understand that's got to be, like even over 10 years, like for example, just going from, $10, 10, 10 of 10 rupees to 1 up to like 50 or 20 or even 20 difference would be, over 10 years is just a huge amount of change. So, uh, it's just hard for me to even comprehend what that might mean. So, but in general, you can also see Thailand is in here, and Taiwan is in this group of, like Taiwan is down there at around 30 to 1, and then you can see Thailand. So Thailand is kind of a surprise here, because, you can see the Philippine peso is actually worth less than the Thai baht, and one of the reasons is because Thailand is part of the mainland, and it's a very centralized trading place, including like Malaysia. So the surprising thing is, why isn't Thailand trying to drop down to the lower group like with Malaysia, right? So uh, some of that may be that Thailand has just got such a complex cultural uh, philosophy there, and as a result, you have this like 33 to 1 kind of transition with the dollar, versus Taiwan, kind of like going down to 30 to 1, right? But again, that's not always good. Sometimes it's great to have some more of these exotic exchange rates, right? So, uh, Now Bangladesh again, you can see is slightly the orange line. What I on the far left there I drew the Indian rupee, but on the right you can see that darker green is Bangladesh. So you can see there what's been going on, right? So in the rupee is certainly one of the more exciting currencies to study in this region, as well as you can see Pakistan kind of like breaking through and showing a different sign there, right? uh, Around 2018, losing significant value against even the Japanese yen. So uh, that's kind of a surprise, right? So we might, we don't, in general, like having a stable currency in Pakistan means that, there's going to be a lot of more stability. There's so many unstable, destabilizing things to worry about. Um, and might as well have a currency that at least you can depend on. So it looks like that's not what we're seeing, because remember, this is an exponential graph and so on. So now last we're going to look at these 1,000 range currencies. So at the top here we have Vietnam, with a kind of a strange but very, it appears to be stable exchange rate, right? So around 20,000 to the dollar, but maybe even 25,000 to the dollar, right? So because once you get this high, when you're talking about 20,000 dong for $1, a little blip, changing by 100 is less than a percent, right? So the interesting one here, obviously, um, would be Indonesia, because there's so many islands, such a complex, geography of Indonesia. So, we might compare that to Malaysia down there, um, but really Indonesia is going to be the most complex in terms of even more complicated than India. It's hard to see that from this graph, but essentially because you have those huge fluctuations in the late 90s, 1998, um, for the Indonesia Rupee. But so the real thing is that in terms of studying, stabilizing that whole Southeast, Indochina area, the India China area, is that Indonesia becomes a very vital part of that. Now, the surprising thing is seeing how solid Cambodia is. One thing you might question is, why would Cambodia, and for some reason did I include Laos? I should probably add Laos. So, but you can see these straight lines in some ways are, it looks like they basically did 4,000. So you'd have to ask some serious questions about who was in charge of doing this, 4,000 to 1 with the dollar. So, because we see places like Thailand, where was Thailand here? So that you can see that Thailand has made a lot of progress being in the 100 to 1 ratio, right? And it looks like Thailand's trying to do 33 or even, better, or 30 to 1. So, it kind of, like what happened here with Pakistan and India, you can see that they kind of change about at the same rate, and are worth about the same because they're bordering each other. So one of the problems you would think is that, well, why not just try to have very similar currency with your neighbors, so that if you're changing, like $1 for 1 Canadian or so on, you basically can start to understand what the real difference is. So, it kind of, the interesting thing about Cambodia is that it's very close to Vietnam, right? And has some, coastal region there, just south and west, in between kind of Thailand and uh, Vietnam. So we would kind of expect, like we do see here, Cambodia's currency, because it's physically, geographically located in between Vietnam and Thailand, being in the middle here. So let me go see if I can get Laos's currency on this really quick. So I just added two more actually. So there is this middle green line, which is Myanmar or Burmese, right? And then I also added the Lao Kip. And so you could kind of expect that the Lao currency would be worth about what the Cambodian is. So uh, unfortunately, it's almost twice less value, right? So uh, obviously, these countries like Cambodia, Laos, Thailand all deserve to have very free transfer of, you know, goods and wealth between those regions, and further kind of working with Vietnam. So you can see that Vietnam, in some ways, is kind of playing the least valuable currency, and in some ways that helps the rest of these guys, because Vietnam has so much coastline, controls so much coastline, right? So that kind of what that means is that if Vietnamese currency drops, uh, what needs to happen is that these countries have to work together, right? So if with fortunately the Vietnamese currency has stayed really solid, so it has, and you can see that Laos has tried to do the same. However, in around 1998, something really, really bad happened, and we don't even know how bad it could have been for Cambodia, at least in terms of currency. So, but looking at Myanmar, this is a very, very important currency, because remember we were looking at India, and if you look on a map, what you know with Myanmar, Burma, basically it's located geographically in between India and China, right? So it's an extremely important country, for the currency in this whole area. And you can see it's very stable with the dollar, around 2000, and then it deflated. So um, perhaps one of the reasons for that is just simply being able to print high quality money. So obviously someone could come in, from one of these kind of Singapore area and kind of redefine the quality of the paper currency and even back it, um, in a special way to kind of like help. The problem is that if any one island like Singapore controls the currency, it could become a huge problem as well. But so the question is whoever can come up with the backing of the currency. So there is a lot of very interesting natural resources, in the mainland, and then very complex places on these islands like Indonesia and the Philippines. Um, but in general, I would say that Myanmar is extremely interesting here, because it's basically in between. It's basically right at the 1,000 to 1 mark. Whether or not that makes sense or who made that decision initially is probably is the original problem, right? So dropping that down certainly, it is very costly to reprint money, but it may be interesting to see a high valued coin or something, and see to try to drop it even, uh, you know, uh, make it be much more worth than a dollar. So anyway, so this is a kind of an overview of all of the currencies in Asia, and hopefully, it's been hopefully very interesting. And let me know if you have any ideas, and I'd be glad to chat with you. Ciao. Anyway, I hope you've really enjoyed this topic on Asian currency. I hope it makes the world a better place. And let me know. See you.